Okay, so getting back to what we were talking about the refusal of the return. So just like the refusal of the call, this is an optional step. But yeah, like I said, the hero might not return to the ordinary world because the ordinary world is not as interesting, doesn't have as much potential for growth. But things have changed around now. The hero has the power to create growth in the ordinary world. So it's a very important thing for them to be able to come back. That said, they may doubt that people will be able to understand what they learned there. They may have something, but will they be able to communicate it to anybody? If it's a elixir of life, will that elixir of life be lost? If it's wisdom, will that wisdom be understood or misunderstood? And it's true that a lot of heroes throughout time found out that people didn't get what they had to say. They didn't listen to them. But it's still important that they try. So very often heroes find themselves being asked to return to the ordinary world anyway. Although some never come back. They have the experience and they never come back. But the full hero story is when they do come back. And we had the example of the Buddha, who the gods asked him to come back to share his wisdom with the world. Okay, but if you do come back, what do you end up with? You end up with freedom to live. And that's what we call kind of the final chapter in this cycle. Another name for it is Master of Two Worlds. Basically, the hero is able to reconcile both worlds. They're able to unify their new wisdom with the world that they have returned to. They've become mature enough to have this wisdom, and even more mature enough to be able to deal with a world that doesn't have this wisdom, and to figure out in what way are they going to give it to people, in what way are they going to share it. Are they going to be leaders? Are they going to be healers? That's the kind of things that the hero is going to have to think about. And I always think of the end of the last Harry Potter movie, where Harry is wise enough to know that he doesn't want the wand that Dumbledore sought and craved for all his life. So he has achieved a wisdom, and he is the one who's now in a position to be a leader and a position to make the world better. So he's gone from being the kid at the mercy of all the sort of forces gathered around him to being in the position of a leader. So that kind of person is able to change the world and to bring about great wisdom. Now, Joseph Campbell says this is not just about heroes, this is about all of us. When we come to circumstances in our life that challenge us and terrify us, but also offer new possibilities, we've got to take those chances and go on our own sort of version of the adventure of the hero. And then when we come back from that kind of experience, we'll have wisdom that we can share with other people. That's what it's really all about. And myths are stories that sort of tend to naturally generate these kinds of ideas, and because they are about what matters. They're about life, they're about energy, they're about the gods, all these things that sort of stand as symbols for the same thing. And when we explore those myths, when we read those myths, when we retell them, we too can understand that kind of story and can see evidence of those patterns in our own lives. So that's Campbell's idea there, which I think is pretty cool. But building off that a little bit more, yeah, let's look at the map again. So you have the call to adventure, which you can refuse, or you can just go straight on through. Either way, you're going on the adventure because you need to. You may have supernatural aid to help you get across, or you may not. You may have to face threshold guardians, or you might not. But in any case, you cross the first threshold, the threshold into the other world. You have figures like helpers and mentors along the way, helping you overcome the road of trials, the challenges and the temptations. And eventually you'll end up at the abyss, the dark night of the soul, where you experience a kind of revelation when you finally overcome this struggle. And this could be in the form of an elixir. This could be in the form of atonement with the Father or union with the goddess. And the father or the goddess might help you get back home, or maybe it's the elixir that helps you get back home, or maybe you have to steal it and you have to run away from the forces that are chasing you. But eventually you cross the return threshold. You may refuse to return, but ultimately it's important that you do return. Even though some heroes do leave forever and never give the people what they need, this is kind of a tragedy. So the real return is the most important thing. And then when one is able to return, one is master of two worlds. And that is someone who can go between these worlds and be part of both, be part of the magical world and the ordinary world. And to some degree, may go on these journeys over and over again, as they find that they need new wisdom and new guidance and new insight. Way we can build on this a little bit more. This is not just one person. This might be something that happens over generations. There might be a hero for one generation who becomes the sort of, I don't know if I'd say villain, but sort of the opponent or obstacle in the next generation. For instance, let me put it like this. You could be the hero and then you could retire. You could have this wisdom and you could have this important thing, but be unable to change. And then the next generation comes along, and to them, you are kind of the stuffy old king who's in control, or the kind of monster version of the father who's like sitting on a throne and not letting any change happen because you're stuck to your version of change. So the next generation has to overthrow you. Something like that. Very often the sons in one generation become the fathers in the next. And maybe in this we can kind of see the pattern we saw with Zeus in Greek mythology and his family members, that there was always this cycle of generations to overcome. And I think that's just kind of an inherent feature of the way generations are, the way parents and children are, but it's something that comes up a lot in the myths. This picture here is of the Fisher King, which is from a story from King Arthur. It's about the Holy Grail. That there was an old man, there was a king who had been wounded, and he was the keeper of the Holy Grail. And so he hid his castle away and he hid himself away. And meanwhile, his kingdom suffered because he was wounded, but he wouldn't accept help from anybody. And then Percival, this young man, came along and wanted to ask him what was wrong, but didn't because he was told he wasn't supposed to. It was too much of an authority figure. And so he never, he didn't get the Holy Grail. He didn't find out. But then much later on, after Percival himself has been wounded by his own brother, he comes along and he comes back and he sees the Fisher King again. And this time he's brave enough to ask the question, what ails you? He even says, what ails you, father? As if the Fisher King is a father figure. And then that heals the king and allows Percival to get the Holy Grail. And it also heals the kingdom, because the Fisher King is a famous story because the kingdom all around him suffered while he was in charge. Just like the old world might be suffering, it might be a wasteland, it might be dried up. But a younger generation with more wisdom can come and go on a journey and have their own experience and bring something new, some sort of new magic that reawakens everything. I think Percival and the Fisher King or the Grail King, as he's sometimes known, make a really good example of that. And the sort of ultimate obstacle figure that kind of controls the ordinary world, according to Joseph Campbell, is what they call the tyrant monster type of figure. Or another name for him is Holdfast. He's some sort of king who has control over everything but is making everything worse. Or he's a dragon dwelling in his cave, And this is kind of where the sort of battle with the father type figure comes into play. So I think there's a lot going on there that's pretty interesting. And so if one hero can't go back and again to the world of adventure, multiple heroes might be needed. And heroes are basically always needed. When the world gets stagnant, somebody has to bring a new idea into the world. And to some degree, these hero stories seem to have something to do with initiation rituals. So hero stories seem to be especially about young people who are coming of age. And initiation rituals are about that too. In a lot of ancient tribal cultures that are developing a lot of this mythology, like the Greeks before they really got going, and a lot of different tribes around the world, there tend to be rituals that allow a young person to make the journey from childhood to adulthood. These are also known as rites of passage or coming of age ceremonies, and very frequently involves, in some of these ancient societies or tribal societies, adults dressing up in these certain costumes to kind of perform a story and lead the young person through all these trials and tests. So basically they are reenacting a myth that fits the pattern of the hero. And then they're kind of leading this young, usually it's a young man, but sometimes it's a young woman, on all these heroic journeys. And it's often very frightening, sometimes involves getting scars. And it's all about leaving childhood behind. And then once they've done this, the child is now an adult and can be part of the adults who are doing this whole thing, doing these rituals. And the weird thing about these rituals is that, on the one hand, they tend to say, the hero was different from society and did something very different. On the other hand, they also say, this is how our society got started. This is what our values should be. This is the way you should act. So it's like heroes have the power to break the rules, but they also are kind of in charge of setting things up. Once the hero has gone on their journey, they make the new rules. They make the new way society should be. And I think that's very similar to the idea of the trickster. Tricksters are often connected to these initiation rituals. And the idea of a culture hero, the culture hero is a kind of hero that is a founder, that defines the rules of the society. And there's some modern examples of initiation rituals. We kind of have things like bar mitzvahs, fraternity initiations are kind of like this. We also have things like graduations. We try to commemorate important events in someone's life and someone's coming of age, but we don't have as many nor as sort of, mythologically deep as the ones we're talking about here. And Joseph Campbell thought that was kind of a way that we were impoverished in our society. And I think Carl Jung thought it too. That was part of his thinking of, it was our lives were in a certain way abnormal, that we weren't as connected to all this stuff as ancient cultures were. And I think it's important to understand that hero myths are not the only myths that are out there, but Joseph Campbell thought that they were the best kind of myth for our modern society. And here's why. Basically, there's two kinds of myths. There's myths that are just about, do what you're told. Don't go into the woods. Don't stray from the path. They convey the sort of norms of your society. They teach you what the values are, the way you should do things. They give people roles that they're supposed to follow, and you're not supposed to leave those roles. And the rituals tell you this is who you're supposed to be. And Campbell says that's actually the majority of myths most of the time. But there are, at the same time, also hero myths. And hero myths help describe someone who rejects society's roles to seek their own potential. And these people become very powerful and very important because they are bigger than just the local society. They are writing the rules of the game. They are playing on their own level. And the hero sort of goes out and they find the new rules and they bring them back and become the founder of the new rules for society. And basically what Joseph Campbell thought is the old traditional type where everybody has a role that they strictly have to stick to, that's not going to work anymore. Basically, when we were different isolated cultures that didn't interact with each other very much, where there was only one set of values, sure, those traditional type of myths, they made sense, because your society existed in one way and you had to play a role in it. But now we live in a world where all these different societies are interacting, and it doesn't make sense anymore to think of things in that way. And people don't want to stay just stuck in one role. So because we live in a different kind of world where we're seeking out meaning and where the old meanings no longer make sense, the hero myth, which is about a person who can go out and find that kind of meaning, is the myth that works really well for us. It used to be only for a few people, but now in our modern world, it kind of applies to everyone. And so by seeking out our own heroic journey, we can make sense of that chaos and find our own meaning in life. And Campbell said that this was basically an important task for everyone to help figure out basically what the future is going to be. And we're almost out of time here, but I just want to read a few words from Joseph Campbell. The modern hero, the modern individual who dares to heed the call and seek the mansion of that presence with whom it is our whole destiny to be atoned, and you can call this God, you can call this magic, you can call this whatever, that hero cannot, indeed must not, wait for his community to cast off its pride, fear, avarice, and sanctified misunderstanding. Live, Nietzsche says, as though the day were here. It is not society that is to guide and save the creative hero, but precisely the reverse. And so every one of us shares the supreme ordeal, carries the cross of the Redeemer, not in the bright moments of his tribe's great victories, but in the silences of his personal despair. That's how Joseph Campbell ends his book. He's basically saying, go out and change the world by figuring out who you are. That's pretty wild. A lot to think about. Okay, I'll leave you guys with that. I do have an announcement, though, so look for that, changing some things up. Look in the announcements. Okay, catch you later.